Welcome to the debate. Before we dive into the analysis today, I want to take a quick moment to explicitly welcome everyone listening over on the Daily English Practice channel. We are absolutely thrilled to have you with us for this discussion.
Yes, absolutely. A very warm welcome to all our listeners from the Daily English Practice channel. It is a real pleasure to be here with you today.
So today we are grappling with a subject that feels honestly universally relevant, probably more than ever. We're talking about tough times. And I don't mean, just having a bad day at the office or a minor inconvenience. We are looking at the full spectrum of crisis. From the macro level, global pandemics, economic downturns, shifting geopolitical landscapes, all the way down to the micro level of personal tragedy, sudden job loss, and grief. The fundamental question is, how do we survive it? And not just survive it, but actually endure with our humanity intact.
Exactly. And the source material we've gathered for this session is, well, it's heavy, but it's incredibly rich. We're looking at the seminal philosophy of Viktor Frankl alongside clinical data from the Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute, NHS guidelines on financial stress, and some really significant studies on social support during global crises that were recently published in Nature Mental Health.
Right. So the central question we are debating today is this. What is the true architecture of resilience? Is it, as I would argue, primarily an act of will, an internal mechanism where we essentially choose our attitude regardless of the external conditions?
Or is it, as I intend to demonstrate, heavily dependent on circumstance, on social infrastructure, and frankly, the permission to acknowledge the dark reality of suffering? Because I firmly believe that focusing solely on mindset risks slipping into a form of denial that just ignores the material realities of people's lives. There's a very fine line between resilience and, well, gaslighting yourself about the severity of your situation.
That is a fair challenge, and I am definitely ready to meet it. Let's begin with the foundation of my position, which rests on the experiences and the writings of Viktor Frankl. As outlined in the real-time performance analysis of Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived the absolute horrors of Auschwitz and Dachau. He wasn't, theorizing from an ivory tower or a comfortable university office. He was observing human behavior at the absolute limits of existence. And his conclusion was radical. He argued that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms.
Which is the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances.
Precisely. Frankl observed prisoners who, despite being starved, beaten, stripped of literally every possession, they walk through the huts comforting others, even giving away their last piece of bread. He argued that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision, not just a result of the camp influences. And this connects directly to the concept of the growth mindset that's discussed in the IE University material, referencing the psychologist Carol Dweck. Resilience isn't a fixed trait. It's a muscle. We build it by reframing failure and suffering, not as a terminal state, but as a call to find meaning. We are inherently responsible for that search.
Look, I don't dispute the power of Frankl's narrative for a second. It is undeniably moving, and historically it's hugely significant. However, I worry that applying that extreme survival logic to everyday structural inequality is, well, it's dangerous. When we look at the material from the NHS regarding money worries and mental health, we see a totally different picture. Mental health is inextricably linked to housing, debt, and unemployment. The NHS explicitly states that worrying about money affects our actual biological ability to manage our mental well-being. It creates this vicious cycle.
But surely, even in poverty, one retains the agency of thought. You aren't suggesting that a lack of money equates to a lack of free will?
No, I'm suggesting that cognitive bandwidth is a finite resource. If your brain is constantly scanning for threats like, will I be evicted? Can I afford to feed my child this week? You literally have less physiological capacity for choosing an attitude. The Help Guide material on resilience emphasizes that true resilience requires acceptance and grieving. It warns against the kind of toxic positivity. If you are facing homelessness or a lack of basic food, telling yourself to simply, choose a better attitude isn't just ineffective, it can be psychologically damaging. It suggests that your suffering is a failure of your own will rather than a failure of the system you're living in. So my thesis is that resilience is about acknowledging limitations and recognizing that some stressors, like the severe cost of living crisis mentioned in the NHS documents, require structural solutions and emotional validation, not just better thoughts.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a slightly different perspective on what better thoughts actually means here. Because I'm not talking about delusion, I am talking about the mechanics of optimism as a very real survival strategy. The Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute, the CTRI, they highlight that optimism is a choice that can be learned. It's a skill. They reference that old 1899 song, Keep on the Sunny Side of Life, not as a mandate to just ignore the dark.
Which sounds dangerously close to just saying, look on the bright side.
No, it's much more rigorous than that. They use it as a metaphor for cognitive restructuring. It is about actively challenging the inner critic. It's about noticing when you are catastrophizing, assuming a situation signals some never-ending pattern of doom, and actively replacing those automatic negative thoughts with realistic, helpful ones. The CTRI suggests the best possible self-exercise, where you visualize a future where things have turned out well. And research shows this actually transforms your life outlook. If you let the darkness consume all your cognitive space, you lose the ability to problem solve. You need that sunny side perspective, so to speak, just to see the path out of the woods.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that unqualified optimism is always the answer. In fact, it can be fatal. Let's go back to your own source, Viktor Frankl. He made an incredibly chilling observation about the death rate in the camp between Christmas 1944 and New Year's 1945.
Ah, you're referring to the spike in deaths.
Yes. Frankl attributed that mass die-off to the fact that many prisoners had lived on the naive hope that they would be home by Christmas. That was their best possible self-visualization, right? When the date passed and the external reality hadn't changed one bit, their immune systems collapsed. They died of disappointment. This proves that looking on the sunny side or visualizing a best possible self without a firm grounding in reality is genuinely dangerous. It's what James Stockdale, another prisoner of war, famously called the Stockdale paradox. You must retain faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties, and at the exact same time, you have to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality.
That is a highly compelling argument, though I would frame it a bit differently. Frankl's point wasn't that hope killed them. It was that misplaced hope killed them. They relied on a specific calendar date rather than a deeper intrinsic purpose. Frankl quotes Nietzsche saying, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." The resilience didn't come from expecting a Christmas liberation. It came from finding meaning in the suffering itself. It's not about ignoring the grief, as you suggest I'm advocating for. It's about integrating the grief into a narrative where you are still the protagonist of your own life.
But can you even be the protagonist if you are completely isolated? This brings me to a really crucial point about social support. Because the narrative of the rugged individual just choosing their attitude in a vacuum ignores the hard data. I want to look at the study published in Nature Mental Health by Choi et al. Regarding depression during a global crisis.
I am familiar with the study. It highlights the value of connection.
It does a lot more than just highlight it. It quantifies it in a way that makes mindset look statistically insignificant. The study found that overall social support was associated with 55% lower odds of depression. But here's the key finding. They found a dose-response gradient.
Meaning, the more support you have, the more resilient you are?
Specifically, the type of support matters. When you combine emotional support, informational support, and tangible support, the odds of depression dropped sixfold.
That is a massive reduction, admittedly.
It's huge, and it strongly supports the idea that resilience is fundamentally a resource issue. Note the term tangible support. That means material help, money, safety, food delivery. The study explicitly mentions that financial stressors were significant effect modifiers. If you don't have tangible support, your risk skyrockets, regardless of your mindset. You cannot mindset your way out of a lack of basic resources. The dose of support determines the response of resilience. It is structural, not just psychological.
I am not convinced by that specific line of reasoning because it positions the individual as a completely passive recipient of support, just waiting for the dose to be administered by society or the government. We can create our own support systems, The help guide material and Frankel both emphasize that we find meaning through love and service to others. When we are in a crisis, one of the absolute most effective ways to regain a sense of control is altruism.
Altruism? When you're the one struggling to survive?
Yes, exactly then. Helping others, volunteering, donating blood, or even just comforting a peer who is also struggling shifts the focus from your own internal suffering to a shared human experience. Think about Frankel's prisoners who gave away their bread. They didn't have tangible support to spare, yet they possessed the highest levels of resilience. They created a microsocial structure through their own agency. I'm not saying you don't need people. I'm saying you don't have to wait for society to save you. You can build the network you need through your own actions.
That is noble. Truly it is. But it assumes a baseline of capacity that not everyone has. The Nature Mental Health studies showed that pre-existing mood disorders were major effect modifiers. If you are already crushed by severe depression, the physiological energy required to create a support system or give away your bread simply isn't there. We need to acknowledge that sometimes the indecent circumstances, to use Frankel's own phrase, are just too heavy for an individual to lift alone. Expecting someone in a deep, depressive episode to volunteer their way to wellness is frankly setting them up for failure.
Well, let's pivot to the practical application of this then. We have discussed the philosophy and the sociology, but what does a person actually do when the walls are closing in? I want to look at the tools for regulation. The source material from Tip Sheet 10 introduces the STOP technique.
Right, classic cognitive behavioral tool.
Yes, a highly effective one because it interrupts the downward spiral. It stands for stop, take a breath, observe, perspective, and proceed. When you are totally flooded with anxiety about the economy or a personal loss, you don't have to be swept away by the current. You can stop. You can use the take a breath step, belly breathing, to physically turn off the sympathetic nervous system's stress response and lower your cortisol levels. You can observe your thoughts with a curious mindset asking, am I overreacting? And then gain perspective. How important will this be in 6 months?
And these are perfectly fine tools for emotional regulation. I use mindfulness myself. Keeping the mind in the present moment is essential, but I come at it from a different angle. Sometimes, breathing through it is a form of avoidance. The NHS advice on employment rights and the Longdom article on coping strategies suggest that sometimes the very best coping strategy is not internal regulation, but external problem solving.
Can you clarify the distinction you're making there?
Certainly, if I am anxious because I might lose my job, breathing helps me feel calm in the moment, sure, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem of unemployment. The NHS suggests knowing your redundancy rights. The Money Helper service advises actively contacting debt charities or asking a lender for a payment holiday. This is behavioral action therapy. It's taking concrete steps to influence your external reality, which then subsequently changes your internal feelings.
It's hijacked by cortisol. The STOP technique isn't about ignoring the problem. It's about stabilizing your physiology so you actually can problem solve. The proceed step in STOP specifically asks, what is the best thing to do right now? It aligns perfectly with your call for action, but it rightfully prioritizes the internal state first. You can't critically read a complex redundancy contract if you are having a panic attack.
Fair enough. I'll grant you that order of operations. But I worry that in the modern self-help world, we severely overemphasize the stop and breathe part and entirely underemphasize the know your legal rights part. The Longdom source explicitly categorizes problem solving as an adaptive coping strategy. That means defining the problem, generating solutions, and implementing them. That is work. It's not just meditation. True resilience involves looking at the dark and troubled side of life squarely and doing the actual paperwork, making the hard phone calls, and navigating the bureaucracy. That is where resilience lives, in the grit of action, not just the calm of the mind.
I agree that action is essential, but let's look at the best possible self-exercise again from the CTRI. It's not just daydreaming. It is a way to identify what you actually want your future to look like, so you know which actions to take in the first place. Without that vision, without that internal why, The actions are totally aimless. You need the internal compass to navigate the external bureaucracy you mentioned. You can fill out forms all day long, but if you don't fundamentally believe there is a future worth filling them out for, you will eventually just stop.
That really brings us back to Frankl, doesn't it? The intersection of the internal and external.
It does. You know, Frankl wrote that there are really only two races of men, not specific nationalities or classes. He said there are the decent and the indecent, and he found both types among the Nazi guards and among the prisoners themselves.
Yes, that was a particularly striking point in the real-time performance article. He recalls a guard, a camp commander actually, who secretly gave him a piece of bread from his own pocket. It wasn't the nutritional value of the bread that saved him, it was the human something in the look that accompanied the gift. It moved Frankl to tears. It acknowledges that even in the absolute worst structural reality, individual acts of decency still matter profoundly.
Exactly. And that perfectly supports my core thesis. Even if the structure around you is utterly indecent, the individual can choose to be decent. That is the ultimate freedom. We can choose to be the person who comforts others, even when we ourselves are suffering. That agency can never be forcibly taken away.
I will concede that point, but I must insist on the closing thought from the help guide regarding grieving your losses. We cannot skip the pain. We cannot skip the reality of the crisis by just being decent. Admitting we are struggling, admitting we are weak, is not a failure of resilience, it is a strength. We must acknowledge that indecent circumstances exist and that they hurt. We have to validate the suffering before we can ever hope to transcend it.
I agree completely. We shouldn't suppress the pain, but we also shouldn't drown in it. We must hold on to that last human freedom, whether it's finding a Nietzschean why or practicing the 3 good things exercise, to actively train our brains to see the good alongside the bad. We retain the power to shape our narrative. We are the authors of our response.
So, perhaps the synthesis here is that resilience is essentially a 3-legged stool. If you take away any one leg, the whole thing falls over.
I like that image. What are the 3 legs?
First, it requires acceptance. Acknowledging the reality of the bad, the grief, and the structural limitations. As I've been arguing, you can't fight a battle you refuse to see.
Second?
It requires action. The problem solving, the social connection, the tangible support. Doing the work, filing the forms, calling the friend.
And third?
It requires attitude. The internal work of finding meaning, cognitive restructuring, and maintaining the sheer will to continue. We need the infrastructure of support, yes, but we also need the architecture of the mind to inhabit it. Acceptance, action, attitude. I think that covers the ground between us quite well. There is certainly more to explore in this material, particularly the nuances of the Nature mental health data on gender and age. It actually turns out age was a significant modifier, with younger people struggling more despite having more connections. But we have laid a very solid foundation today.
Indeed we have. It is a deeply complex topic, but one absolutely worth examining. Thank you for engaging in this with me.
Thank you. It was a rigorous and enjoyable discussion.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into resilience. We hope you found some tools here today, whether internal or external, to help you navigate your own challenges. Before you go, please remember to subscribe to the Daily English Practice channel to stay updated with more content like this.
Yes, please do subscribe to the Daily English Practice channel. We really appreciate your continued support. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.